these topics?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Going back to when I was a boy, my father was an engineer, and they played cards every Friday night, alternating back and forth between our house and their house with the local television engineer of KELO in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And this man was an electronics engineer. He had worked with the British during World War II on radar and things like that. So conversation around the table was was always about something about engineering and what got me started. My father and he, I remember one conversation they were having as they were playing cards, and I was sitting there watching them. They were talking about the Great Pyramid, and viewing it from the engineer's point of view, which was an interesting conversation. So I've always been kind of interested in all these topics, and I did I did a presentation actually at the behest of another professor of some of my ideas about the pyramid for a class that we were both teaching at the University of Oklahoma, and the students loved it. And then she said, "Well, they love that. You really ought to write this up in a book." So I did, and much to my surprise, the book took off, and I followed it up with a couple of other books that I had intended to write if the book did well, and I just kind of fell into this by accident, to be quite honest with you.
And that's the Giza Death Star, published in 2001?
Yep. Right, Giza Death Star, and then there was Giza Death Star Deployed, and then I followed that up with Reich of the Black Sun, about the World War II Nazi atomic bomb research, which I think was a very different story from the one that we've been told. And then from there, it just kind of took off.
Well, tell me a little bit about the Giza Death Star. People hear that, they think Star Wars, they might think ancient aliens. What is it about?
Well, you're right. The title says it all. It's basically about my hypothesis that the structure there, the Great Pyramid, taking off with the research of Chris Dunn, was some sort of machine. But I also looked at Zecharia Sitchin, his book, The Wars of Gods and Men, where he clearly implies, it's a strange thing, he clearly implies by the text that he examines in that context that it was some sort of weapon, but he never pursues that idea. And so I thought, well, let's look at these texts ourselves and look at some of the things present in the structure and see if that hypothesis makes sense. Was it a weapon? And that's essentially the hypothesis that I advanced in those 3 pyramid books.
So it was a weapon. What kind of weapon? Was it used to fight off other aliens, or was it used for some other purpose?
No, I think it was in all seriousness, although it sounds like a wild, woolly, and crazy idea, I think it was a weapon of tremendous power, possibly even something that was much more destructive in its potential than our largest hydrogen bombs. But, pardon me, it was a weapon that, pardon me, that in my opinion may have been based on the ability to manipulate the fabric of space-time. And anytime you say that, anytime you have this idea that you can bring that capability down to the laboratory bench, so to speak, and manipulate that capability, then the potential, if you weaponize that capability, is quite literally almost the sky's the limit. It's a capability that would make our large hydrogen bombs look like a firecracker. So it's a radical hypothesis, to be sure. And when those books came out, particularly the first 2, I was overwhelmed because I had these angry emails from other people in the alternative research community, in 1 or 2 cases, some reasonably well-known names, and they were just jumping all over me. Well, how dare you upset the jonquils and daisies view of ancient Thai civilization? So that the negative press actually helped me. So.
Any press is good press.
Yeah, any press is good press. That's right. Oscar Wilde said that, and he was right.
So what about other pyramids, or other pyramids you think that were built, whether in Egypt or the ziggurats in Sumer or the ones in Central and South America? Are they used for the same reason, or do they have another purpose?
Well, I think at the very minimum, I actually wrote another book much later in the series called The Grid of the Gods. And the subtitle of that is something to the effect of the physics of the pyramid peoples. And while I don't necessarily think that all of those things were built as weapons, it's very clear that they are built with some machine-like properties in mind, particularly the pyramids in Mesoamerica and then northward into Mexico. I think these things are, at the very minimum, they had some sort of machine-like purpose. If you look at their structure, if you look at the implied mathematics behind them, I even hypothesized in that book that some of the temples on the tops of these things appear to me to look like some sort of radio resonant cavity. In other words, they interact with frequencies on the infrared end of the spectrum, infrared on into radio and microwave and so on. So yeah, I think there's some machine-like purpose. As to what the total picture is, what it adds up to, I don't know, other than to say beyond the statement that you're dealing with clearly a culture or civilization that knew a lot more than we think they did.
Right, maybe even more than we do now today, you think?
Well, that's the conclusion I clearly came to in the case of the Great Pyramid. I kept bumping into a very strange phenomenon. I converted some of the dimensional measures of the coefficients of constants of quantum mechanics to British imperial measure. And the reason I did that is if you do a little research, you find that British imperial measure is actually very close to the system of measure that apparently the Great Pyramid was built on. And once you do that and then start playing around with dimensional measures in that structure, you get harmonics, in other words, multiples of those coefficients over and over again. So in other words, it's not simply, to my non-statistician's eye, you get so many of them that this doesn't appear to be entirely accidental. Now, what I've just told you, if that's true, and please underline that word if that's true, if what I found there is actually there, then that means that somebody way back when who built that thing knew all about quantum mechanics before Max Planck, before it was a smile on his face. So, the anomalies of the structure, any way one slices it, even if that isn't true, the anomalies in the structure are such that you do find dimensional analogs of the Gaussian magnetic constant. You find analogs that will give you the speed of light. You have analogs that will give you precise measures of the distance to the sun, even the neutral point of gravity between the Earth and the Moon. So you ask yourself, well, what in the name of sense are all these things doing in that structure? Why are they there? The bottom line is that means that whoever built it knew about those things and therefore had to have a fairly sophisticated science, a fairly sophisticated metrology, and they embodied all of that in the structure.
Now, do you contribute that, and there's a lot of different factors that could go into this question, but do you contribute that to the idea of ancient aliens or perhaps a golden age culture that was just very advanced?
Yeah, a golden age culture that was very advanced. I actually followed those books up later in the series. Once I got started with this, and I have to tell people that, like I say, I had originally intended, if the initial book took off, I had about 5 other books in mind that I wanted to write, kind of planned out, mapped out, if that book took off. Well, it did, so I wrote the other 5 books. One of them was a book called The Cosmic War, and the subtitle of that is Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Ancient Texts and Modern Physics, or something like that. So it kind of gives you the idea, and basically the thesis of that book is that whatever existed way back when in the mists of prehistory may have actually been some sort of interplanetary civilization right here in our own solar system. And again, that sounds like a wild, woolly, radical, bizarre hypothesis, but when you start looking at the texts and what they actually say, when you start looking at some of the various things scattered around the solar system, we see all the anomalies on Mars, we see Saturn's moon, oddly enough, Saturn's moon Iapetus, looking like it might be something artificial. That in itself is interesting, of course, because Saturn is the home within Greek mythology of the Gigantomachy, of the war with the giants. So you get all these little indicators from ancient texts and lore and tradition and so on that something tremendously catastrophic happened in the midst of prehistory, and it was the result of a war. So those books all kind of tie together.
Now, I didn't get a chance to read the Giza Death Star. I've read the SS Brotherhood of the Bell and Nazi International. In the Giza Death Star, maybe in the second book, the Giza Death Star Deployed, did you talk about the obelisk and the energetic relationship between that and perhaps a weapon that in that of the Giza pyramids?
Right. If you look at, one of the things that's very interesting is if you look at these structures, particularly the Great Pyramid, but not necessarily that, you can look at certain ancient temples. I went into this aspect of the story in another book way down the line in the series called Babylon's Banksters. If you look at some ancient temples and apply just kind of basic, simple radio engineering principles, you look at these temples, and what you're looking at, if you look at them with the eyes of engineering, is you're looking at very, very simple radio resonant cavities. So again, these people had a science of some sort, and they were certainly embodying it in their structures. And obelisks, oddly enough, are some of them, because you can go to Egypt and strike these things, create a physical stress actually on the structure, and they will be resonant to particular frequencies. So again, it looks like they were doing something. We don't know why exactly they were doing it or what the basis of their science was. I kind of take the view of John Anthony West that Egypt, if you look at their own lore of how Egypt describes itself, it describes itself as a legacy of something much more sophisticated. And again, the mystery of Egypt, just as with Mesopotamia, is you have the origin of these civilizations with absolutely no precursors. They're just all of a sudden there. And they've got this tremendously advanced mathematics and so on and so forth. So where does that come from? They don't just pop up out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. With that information, with that knowledge, and with your research, have you seen, because you mentioned when you first came out with this, you were kind of attacked. Have you seen more and more people open up to this information, be less skeptical?
Well, I won't say that they're more open to it, other than the attacks stopped. And the interesting thing, I don't know exactly why, but one of the interesting things was one of these people that had originally attacked me said that, well, you're describing the work of the Ukrainian physicist Volodymyr Krasnoholovets. And if you do a little research onto this guy, he was, at the time of the Soviet Union, he was involved in the Soviet Union's very secret pyramid research projects. This is now, pardon me, these projects are now known, but at the time that the Soviet Union still existed, it had very top secret research into pyramid power, quite literally. And the Soviets built these big pyramids all over Russia, some of the biggest ones just outside of Moscow. You can go online and see pictures of these things now, but at the time that they were built, this was all a highly classified project. So anyway, this fellow who was angry, he had contacted me and basically given me these long emails denouncing my theory and basically, how dare you upset the jonquils and daisies apple cart, and I'm going to send your copies of your books to Dr. Krasnoholovets. And I said, well, fine, And so I wait several months, and not a word comes back from this guy. But interestingly enough, after he did this, and these copies were known, the biophysicist in this country, Dr. John DeSalvo, who runs a website called the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association, invited me to be a member of it. And I thought, well, sure, fine, so I accepted his membership. And then the next thing I knew, my publisher contacted me and says, well, the Russians want to buy rights to the Giza Death Star. So the Giza Death Star actually exists in a Russian language edition.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't know what that means, but, but apparently I've always in my mind connected it to the fact that those pyramid books were sent to Krasnoholovets, and then the next thing I know, the Russians are buying rights to the book and publishing the book. So
well, it has to make you feel good in some way that it's getting international attention.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
exactly.
Now, what about some of your other works here? The ones that obviously that I've read, right, of the Black Sun and the Esed Brotherhood of the Bell. I've always had a fascination with history of Europe, World War I, World War II, and the rise of the Nazis in Europe. But specifically, Joseph, the alternative history, if you will, the one that we're not really told about. Let's get into a little bit of details about that. Maybe we can describe Reich of the Black Sun and then talk a little bit about the Bell Project.
Okay. Well, the Nazi series of books are a major component of all of my books. I have 22 books out, and I kind of alternate back and forth between ancient topics like pyramids and ancient civilizations and the Nazis, and there is a reason for that. Part of the reason is that the Nazi Party was midwifed into existence in the interwar period by its connections to a number of German secret societies. The most familiar to people would be a society that was known as the Thule Gesellschaft. It's usually mispronounced
Thule Society, right?
Thule. It's not Thule. In German, it's Thule. But the Thule Gesellschaft, or the Thule Society, was basically one of these interwar occult-based secret societies. Their logo was even the swastika. So you have this connection, and part of the teaching of that particular society was that the Aryan race, that mythology, the Aryan race was a legacy race of a very ancient, very high civilization. So, in other words, you have that meme in the background working within the Nazi Party, and more particularly within the SS, particularly Himmler. The Reichsfuhrer SS was tremendously obsessed with the occult. And
he even used the Zeigel, the rune, as part of their logo, correct?
Yes, he used the runes and everything else. That had its own occult basis because there were people connected to the peripheries of the Thule Gesellschaft, like Lanz von Liebenfels and Guido von List and people like that did studies of runes and so on and so forth. So all of these things had definite occult esoteric background in the symbolism that the Nazis ultimately adopted. But the other thing that got me interested in that whole Nazi angle is ever since I was a boy, I've just been profoundly mystified by how they could suffer from such a mathematical and scientific dyslexia during the entire period of the war as not to be able to come up with an atomic bomb. This is one of the great mysteries, and the usual explanation of what I call the post-war Allied legend is that, well, the Nazis, they persecuted Jewish physics and Einstein left and so on and so forth. But what most people don't realize is that nuclear physics has very, very little to do with relativity, number one. And number two, even if they did lose a great number of scientists that fled Europe because of the Nazi regime, they still retained a number of very first-class top drawer scientists, and Heisenberg, Paul Hartek, Otto Hahn, Walter Gerlach. These were big names in international physics circles prior to the war, and they remained in Nazi Germany during the war. So to me, there's a mystery here, and I just wasn't satisfied with explanations. And the real key for me with this, Ryan, was the fact that after German reunification, circa 1992-93, the tail end of the Bush administration, the early years of Clinton, after German reunification, a funny thing happened. that was the United States began to declassify a lot of stuff that had existed in the archives about Nazi wartime secret research, and a lot of it had to do with their atomic bomb program. And I started running into these documents. I reproduce a couple of them in Reich of the Black Sun that indicate very definitely that the German atomic bomb program was not the colossal failure that we were taught. If anything, it may have been actually successful prior to the war's end. And so that set me off. Well, if that's the case, what else? What else were the Nazis up to?
Right.
We know about the V2s. We know about the V1s. Most people don't know about the television-guided missiles. Early forms of smart bombs, if you will. Most people don't know about their surface-to-air missiles, their acoustic homing torpedoes, and all of this
very
stuff.
Sophisticated stuff.
Well, essentially what you're looking at is Mark I versions of the types of weaponry that we now take for granted.
Yep.
All of this was being developed in the Third Reich, and some of it had been developed to the point that they had either been tested or even deployed. The first operational jet fighter was German, even though the British had, Whipple playing around with jets. The Royal Air Force wasn't really interested until the Germans showed up in the skies with jet fighters. So, that kind of spurred the interest there. But
wow.
So you have all those things that were known, and so you start digging around and in the really exotic stuff. And the reason I put Reich of the Black Sun dealing with the atom bomb at the head of the Nazi series is that the real story for me was this story about the bell. And in fact, that story has it's such a big story, in my opinion, that I've taken several books to describe the story and the implications of the story if it's true. I do think it is true, but the implications of it are what really, really intrigued me. So that followed SS Brotherhood of the Bell, kind of started that off. And the reason I headed it up, this whole Nazi series with the atom bomb project, is that if you look at the context, the Bell story, the Germans actually classified this device in one of their documents. They referred to this device with the classification of Kriegsentscheidend, which in German means war decisive. And so I got to thinking, well, if their atom bomb project isn't Kriegsentscheidend, if that's not war decisive, then exactly what is this thing?
So they put Die Glocke over top of the atomic bomb in terms of importance.
Yeah, exactly. And you look at this device, let me describe it for people and what the allegations of the story are, because this is very important for people to understand how I research. I footnote my books extensively, and I do try to let people know that when I'm constructing an argument, I'm speculating. Because there's a body of people out there, and to a certain extent their research is good, it's solid, that think the Bell was nothing more than an isotope enrichment centrifuge. I think they're mistaken for reasons that we're going to get into. The Bell is a device about 12 feet wide, 15 feet tall. It's obviously bell-shaped. That's why the Germans called it Die Glocke, the bell. And on the inside of this device, they had two counter-rotating metal cylinders. It was an electrically polarized device. Those cylinders rotated around a central core that I think was the cathode to the cylinder's anode. They would counter-rotate these cylinders to tremendous speed. They would inject into them a substance known as serum 525. This is all part of the Bell story. Serum 525, in its turn, was supposedly a very gooey type of heavy liquid maroon-colored metal, which, if you look at it, the descriptions of it, this substance looks to be some compound of mercury and something else. I argue the case in another book, The Philosopher's Stone, that yet another ingredient in this substance may have been thorium-229 isomer. I lay out the case for that in a book called The Philosopher's Stone. And they would rotate this substance up. Now let's look at what they're doing. First of all, when you rotate it, it's going to cohere the plane of rotation of the substance. And then what they did is they zapped this substance while it was in a state of rotation with gobs, and I do mean gobs, of high voltage direct current electricity. Now what would that do? Well, if mercury is involved, it's going to create a plasma. That plasma is going to be in a state of differential rotation because you've got the cylinders in counter rotation with each other. So you're going to have plasma in a state of rotation under electromagnetic stress, okay? So what does that sound like? Well, it sounds like the sun, okay? So I think what they were trying to do is, number one, they were trying to reduplicate the effects of the sun. Well, for what purpose? And I think once you look at kind of the argument that I present in SS Brotherhood of the Bell and then the following books, was they were attempting, first of all, to create or engineer a device on the basis of some of the interwar unified field theories that predicted a coupling effect between electromagnetism and gravity. The most famous interwar theory being, again, a German mathematician by the name of Kaluza. If you look at unified field theories from that time, you're going to find his name mentioned quite a lot. You have another influence on all of this being an electrical engineer by the name of Gabriel Krohn, who came to this country. He was a Jewish man, but a brilliant man. But he published a paper in Europe in the interwar period that he won a prize for at the University of Liège in Belgium in 1935. And it was all about how electrical engineers were noticing these anomalies, and they could take the unified field theories that had been published in the interwar period, particularly in Germany, and use those unified field theories to explain what was going on in the anomalies that engineers were noticing in large networked rotating electrical systems. Now, that's a mouthful, but what he's really told you is that you can take all these theories and bring them down right to the laboratory bench, and with mid-1930s electrical technology, engineer the fabric of space-time. That's exactly what the implications were that he's told you. So the Germans, I think, were basically attempting to construct a kind of a gateway technology based on some of these ideas to see if they could affect an electromagnetic gravity coupling. And the interesting thing is that the bell, if you do the research and dig into the story, you'll discover that the people that were working on the bell reported that it levitated, all right, as it was turned on. Now, this is huge, because what this means, if that's true, then this means that the Bell story is the story that's at the heart of the Nazi UFO legend. Now, please note, all the device did was it levitated. It didn't zip around the sky performing right-angle turns at several thousands of miles an hour or things like this. In other words, it did not perform as a UFO did. So that's I think, a huge clue as to what the Nazis were up to. They had a gateway technology that gave them some sort of rudimentary field propulsion capability. It gave them, therefore, an ability to tinker with the fabric of space-time at a very rudimentary level. But again, once you say that, the door is open, because if you have that capability, number one, you have the possibility for a totally different type of energy supply, which certainly the Nazi SS was looking at. You have the ability for field propulsion, a totally different way of propulsion, of transport. And then finally, of course, as I've indicated, if you have that capability, then if you weaponize it, then potentially you can make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So would the Nazis classify that higher than the atom bomb?
Yeah,
you betcha.
Definitely. Well, all very, very fascinating, Joseph. We're going to take a quick break here.
It's interesting that you mentioned the term Wunderwaffe because I rely on the Bell research of Polish researcher by the name of Igor Witkowski, wrote a wonderful book called The Truth About the Wunderwaffe. It's really an extraordinary book. I highly recommend it to your readers. Even it is very expensive, but it's just an extraordinary book. In the book, he notices that the term Wunderwaffe was used at the time that the V2s and V1s were already raining down on London. And he points out the fact that in the context in which the Nazis at the time are speaking of the Wunderwaffe, that these weapons, which are usually misidentified by historians as being the wonder weapons, could not have been the wonder weapon. Militarily, they produced really no significant result other than being a major nuisance to Churchill's government and so on. So, and he also cites people like Magda Goebbels, Dr. Goebbels' wife, talking about the Wunderwaffe and clearly indicating that in the context that this term is referring to something else. And in his opinion, and I think he's absolutely correct, that the term is actually being applied to the Bell. And if you look at the physics, if you go back and look at what they're doing with the Bell, as I laid it out, it's dealing with physics of interfering several electromagnetic rotating fields on a plasma. They're creating basically a kind of technological version, miniature version of the sun, for all intents and purposes. Well, this is very similar to the types of concepts that you see often alleged for the Philadelphia experiment in this country, taking large degaussing electromagnetic coils on the three axes of a ship and creating an interference pattern which they hoped would lead to some sort of radar stealth, radar invisibility. And according to the lore, of course, it produced optical invisibility. But the basic concepts are the same. So in other words, we're dealing with physics and a technology that, if true, and I think definitely you can look at the literature of the period. I wrote another book in this Nazi series called Secrets of the Unified Field, the Philadelphia Experiment, the Nazi Bell, and the Discarded Theory. The discarded theory being, of course, all of these interwar unified field theories from Kaluza down to Levati and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing is if you look in modern physics literature, Michio Kaku and some other people that popularize the history of physics, they'll tell you that these unified field theories from the interwar period were incomplete theories and that they did not take into account the strong and weak nuclear forces of quantum mechanics. Well, that's all true, but the problem is an incomplete theory doesn't necessarily mean a non-engineerable one.
Okay.
That's pretty much what Gabriel Krohn, in his paper that I talked about in the first part of the show, was saying. He was saying that, these theories are engineerable theories, and if they're engineerable, what he's telling you is, yeah, you can play around with 1930s technology with the fabric of space-time. And this is precisely what I think the Nazis did. Now, you've mentioned in your introductions a book of mine called The Nazi International. That's an important part of this story because what happened at the end of the war with Nazi technology is really rather interesting if you look at it carefully and take the blinkers that they've taught us to read the end of the war in textbooks and college history courses. Take those blinkers off and look at what's really going on. If you look at it carefully, the Nazis themselves are the ones driving the technological division of the spoils at the end of the war. So, for example, you have the creme de la creme of their rocket and jet scientists and ramjet scientists and so on going to the United States. The Soviets, on the other hand, are getting the middle echelon project managers and technicians in the hundreds that are able to reconstruct the documents trail for the Soviets and kind of jumpstart their own post-war rocket program under Sergei Korolev and people like that. So you get basically the Nazis driving the division of the spoils very carefully, so that at the end of the war, a technological stalemate, an arms race, is going to be induced by this technology transfer to the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, interestingly enough, the Bell itself, the SS, under orders, I think probably from Martin Bormann, murdered some 60 scientists that were working on the Bell project. The project itself goes completely missing, and there's an arguable case that the device itself may have either been deliberately disassembled and flown in a gigantic Junkers 390 aircraft. This aircraft was a 6-engine aircraft that was capable of mid-air refueling. It's one of the earliest aircraft that had that capability. And it was capable, even without that, of flying nonstop from Germany to Argentina, for example, which is where I think the Bell project and documentation actually ended up, because in that book, Nazi International, I talk about a post-war project that was being conducted under the auspices of Juan Perón's government in Argentina and being run by some Nazi scientists that had fled to Argentina after the war. And if you look at what they're doing, they're talking about plasmas in rotation under high electromagnetic stress. Okay, so there's the Bell. It goes to Argentina, or at least some aspects of it do. And they continue to research it themselves under the auspices of Perón's government. And that's hugely significant, because what this means is that they kept all the real goodies to themselves, essentially. The project was inadvertently exposed by Perón in a 1951 press conference in Buenos Aires, and it created a firestorm, something of a firestorm in the world press at the time. The German scientist that was heading this thing up was denounced as a fraud and a mountebank and so on and so forth. But after the project was shut down by Perón, we don't know exactly where it goes, but it's interesting, and I talk about this in that book, that after 1954, after our first hydrogen bomb tests, the Mike test and the Castle Bravo test in particular, these two hydrogen bombs were predicted to have a certain yield, and they actually ran away, particularly Castle Bravo, with a much bigger yield. So what did the U.S. Air Force do? Well, while it's publicly denouncing this German scientist as a fraud and mountebank, it's secretly sending people down to Buenos Aires to interview this German scientist and find out just what the heck he was up to. So, and it's interesting when you read his own statements about what he was up to, he was telling them, I'm putting plasma into rotation and subjecting it to enormous amounts of electromagnetic stress, and what this does, he says, is it produces a cellular structure in the plasma that interacts with what he calls a kind of cellular structure in space-time, and here comes the whopper, and he actually says this, and it's one of the first cases, I think, that you can find where the phrase zero-point energy is used openly and directly in any literature, and he's using that very phrase to describe what he thinks is an interaction between rotating plasmas under electromagnetic stress and the zero-point energy, and is transducing that energy into the plasma reaction. So, there's your explanation, guys, for why your hydrogen bombs have a lot more bang than you've calculated. So, in other words, the Bell project has huge, extraordinary implications in my reconstruction of events. And again, I want to stress for people the reason why I've written so many books pursuing different details of the project is it would be just impossible to summarize the project and its implications in just one book. So it has implications that literally spill out everywhere you turn.
Now,
the interesting thing about this guy's project, his name is Dr. Ronald Richter. His project in Argentina is in that book, The Nazi International. I point out that he's getting his equipment to conduct this project in Argentina from the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, the German electrical company, that was the very company that was involved in the Bell Project back in Nazi Germany. So in other words, there's little details like that connect his project to the wartime research of the Bell. So it's a huge story, because what it's also telling us is that this post-war group of Nazis, we've got to get it out of our head that these are just a bunch of guys hiding in the jungles of Brazil and the Amazon basin in fear of their life. What it's really telling you is you're dealing with a post-war Nazi extraterritorial state, if you will, that is tremendously well financed. It has its own production and scientific infrastructure that it's able to conduct and carry on some of this wartime research. So that's quite a different story. And again, it sounds radical and just harebrained to say something like that, but I urge people to look at the actual evidence for that rather than leap to any conclusions.
Right. Well, I think that's the problem, is that people leap to those conclusions without really thinking about it, because we've been predisposed, preconditioned, and brainwashed to believe that this is how history is, when in fact it's not. It is the proverbial history is written by the victor kind of a case.
Right.
Now, one of your other books is Roswell and the Reich. I'm guessing that Roswell has a little bit to do with the Bell, too, maybe?
Oh, yes. I call Roswell and the Reich the book that ufology loves to ignore, because the silence about that book from the ufology community has been almost deafening. The book essentially explores the whole Roswell mythology, as I like to call it, and I point out in that book that you're really dealing in that story with two very, very different data sets. On the one hand, you have the data set of the technology, the memory metal, the strange lightweight foil that you could crumple up and that would unfold back into a non-creased state, and so on and so forth. And then you have the story about the bodies. And I dissect the Roswell mythology very, very carefully. But basically my hypothesis, to boil it down to a nutshell, is what if it was not something extraterrestrial that crashed in the New Mexico desert in July of 1947? What if it was, in fact, something that looked like it may have been based on Nazi technology? Now, it's interesting when you phrase it that way, because if you look at the documents and stories associated with the Roswell story, particularly the Shulgin Air Force Intelligence Collection Memorandum that a bunch of Roswell researchers always refer to, if you look at that memorandum carefully and read the whole thing, it's a genuine document. It is a genuine U.S. Air Force Intelligence Collection Memorandum that was drawn up by Brigadier General Shulgin. And if you look at it, it's clearly a document, and I think the Roswell researchers are correct. It's clearly a document drawn up in the wake of Roswell to go out and find out just what the heck are we dealing with here. But the interesting thing that the ufologists don't like to talk about is when you read that memorandum, it's not talking about extraterrestrials, and it's not talking about a field propulsion flying saucer. It's talking about vapor trails, the roar of jet engines. If you read it carefully, it's talking about vectored exhausts. And most significantly, in that memo, it points a finger very clearly and very explicitly. It's not something that's implied, but it's very explicit, that this looks like it's based on some sort of technology that we saw the Germans playing around with during World War II. And so we'd better find out where the Horton brothers are. Okay. So, and they've been, this memo mentions these characters by name. Well, who are the Horton brothers? Well, the Hortons are the two German aerodynamic engineers that were coming up with those flying wings, prior to the war, and flying these things around. And it's interesting, when you look at their flying wing designs, Northrop Grumman actually built a full-scale mock-up of the Horton 229 Gotha flying wing.
Yeah.
At a cost of $250,000 using, original paints, original materials and everything. And why'd they do this? Why did Northrop Grumman go to all of that expense?
I've seen those pictures before. It's crazy. It's
crazy. Well, what's really crazy is, you're looking at this thing that these German engineers came up with, this flying wing, in the late 1930s.
I know, decades ago.
Yeah, decades ago, and this thing looks very modern.
It's like the B-2 bomber.
It looks like the B-2 bomber, a smaller version of it. Well, Northrop Grumman did this because they wanted to test the radar cross-section of this thing, and they found out that it had about a 25% reduction of an ordinary airplane radar signature. In other words, it was partially stealthy. So, anyway, the Shulgin Memorandum, in the wake of Roswell, is asking, well, where are the Horton brothers? We need to find out where the Horton brothers are. Well, I can tell you where they were. And I tell you, in the Nazi International, they were down in Argentina building triangular-shaped jet aircraft for Juan Perón. So again, we have another little indicator that there's some real sophisticated post-war Nazi research going on in the world, and we're not in charge of it. So let's assume if something Nazi, just play speculation here. If something Nazi crashes in the New Mexico desert in July of 1947, fully 2 years after World War II has supposedly ended, then is this going to send the U.S. military into a tailspin of panic? Yeah, probably would.
Well, I'm guessing they're going to use the image of aliens in order to promote that, to distract away from what really happened.
Right, exactly. That's exactly what I think happened. I call it the Roswell dialectic because if you look at the story, it is true that within hours, the U.S. Air Force is sending out stories. Oh, we recovered a flying saucer, and then hours later, oh, it's just a weather balloon, and our intelligence agent at the only functioning atomic bomb wing in the entire United States Air Force misidentified a weather balloon with a flying saucer. So my question is, well, why would you have an intelligence officer like that in charge of your base intelligence? This is doing Major Marcel a tremendous disservice, And the answer is, of course, you wouldn't have someone that stupid in charge of your base intelligence. So there's another story altogether going on. I think if you look at the technology the stories about the technology surrounding Roswell, and then the Air Force memoranda that begin to be circulated after the event. I think it's a very, very different story than standard ufology likes to put out there, and like I say, that's the reason I call Roswell and the Reich the book that ufology loves to ignore. It's actually my longest book. It's about 500 pages long because I go through the whole story with a fine-toothed comb.
Well, that's what you have to do to get to the truth. That you get these people who believe the mainstream narrative without a question of a doubt, and they ridicule anybody who tries to dig a little bit deeper. And then you get the people on the other side of the spectrum, Joseph, what you call ufologists per se, and they so badly want to believe UFOs, aliens, and the connection between them that they will look for any evidence to back up what they believe. So when you come at it from this point of view, and this is actually what got me, I think, really into your work and your research, because I've always believed the same thing, that Roswell was a type of distraction, and all of those, the crazy things like say they misidentified it, and it was a weather balloon, then it's a flying saucer, and going back and forth. It just causes confusion, and eventually people give up and they stop asking questions.
Right, exactly.
One of the big things for me, I think, and probably a lot of the listeners, and people have even asked me a similar question like this before, if the Nazis were so far advanced, looking at technology far beyond the atom bomb, if they didn't even classify that as super uber top secret, then why did they not win the war?
Well, I get asked that question all the time. First of all, the Bell story, let's go back to that. I discount all those stories. I wrote a book called Saucers, Swastikas, and Psyops. And in that book, I take the whole Nazi UFO field propulsion flying saucer myth and legend and expose it for what I think it really is. Number one, I think it's a cover story put out after the war by certain circles within the CIA and within this post-war Nazi group. Number one, to deflect attention from the Bell. And let me again emphasize what I said about the Bell previously. This thing levitated, but that's all it did. It didn't dart around the sky like a UFO, all right? So in other words, it wasn't a Nazi UFO. It was a gateway technology. It had tremendous potential, tremendous promise, but let's not overemphasize what it was. It was not a UFO in the traditional sense. So I discount all those stories that we hear about Hanabu and Vril and their trips to the moon and Mars and all that nonsense, because there's no a shred of good provenance. There's no way that you can reverse engineer the physics, which you can do in the Bell story. And for me, that's essential, because it's not necessarily the case that the evidence for the Bell story is any different than your typical UFO, crash and recovery story. But there are enough details in the Bell story that allow you to reconstruct a kind of putative or speculative physics trail based on the physics literature of the period and what some of those scientists were actually thinking. So in other words, it's the ability to reverse engineer the physics of this device that to me is essential to evaluating its evidentiary value or possibility as a true story or not. You do not have that in the case of the Hanabu or Vril. You have no indication of what the possible physics thinking might have been behind these devices, and therefore I tend to totally dismiss that whole story. The interesting thing that we have to bear in mind here, again, is those memoranda that began to be circulated in the U.S. Air Force after the Roswell crash are consistent in pointing the finger of suspicion at these Nazi projects. So why didn't they win the war if they had all this stuff? Well, for one thing, you're dealing with prototype technology. In other words, this is not operationally deployable technology. But in the cases of things like the Horten Flying Wing and some of the other stories that we have coming out of Nazi Germany of experimental saucer-shaped jet-powered aircraft, that's a very different matter, and they might have perhaps been able to get some of those projects to some sort of testing stage where they were usable as deployable aerodynes with human pilots. And the other thing I get all the time is, well, if the Nazis had the atom bomb, why didn't they use it? And I actually tend to think that there's two answers to this that I talk about in Reich of the Black Sun. And that is, number one, they didn't have the strategic delivery capability. An atom bomb at the time is an extraordinarily heavy device. They didn't have the ability, with the exception of a very few airplanes, to deliver these things to any strategically valuable targets in the West. And number two, the Nazi ideology was such that their most genocidal and brutal military fighting and campaigning wasn't with the Western Allies, it was with the Soviet Russians. And there we're confronted with a real problem, because if you look at the total number of casualties during World War II, and I'm going to get into some gruesome statistics here, and I beg everybody's indulgence because it's an essential part of the argument. If you look at the total casualties of World War II, fully one half or more than one half of the casualties of the entire war on all fronts are suffered by the Russians. And if you look at the military casualties that are inflicted on the Russians, this is somewhere around 9 to 10 million men. Total German military casualties for the entire war on all fronts is something like 2 to 3 million. I forget the exact figure. So this means if you look at military historians and the way that they have looked at the tactical and operational proficiency of the German Wehrmacht during World War II. This means that right up to the end of the war, against all combatants, the German army had a kill ratio of about 1 to 1.5. In other words, one German soldier is worth about 1.5 Allied or Russian soldiers. This is a tactical and operational competence that, particularly when you figure in what's going on the Eastern Front, the scale of slaughter that's being inflicted on the Russians there is just totally beyond any normal operational tactical capability. This means that there may have been other types of weaponry that we've never heard about in use on the Eastern Front. And when you turn to those possibilities, you do find some very interesting things. There are persistent rumors. I cite a case of a Japanese cable from the military attaché in Stockholm to Tokyo that talks about the Germans using the Gensei Bakudan on the Eastern Front. And this is a cable that was sent in 1943. Well, what's the Gensei Bakudan? Well, it's Japanese for atomic bomb. Okay? So in other words, the Japanese military in attaché in Stockholm is telling Tokyo that, yeah, the Germans are using some sort of atomic bomb on the Eastern Front. So why haven't we heard about this? Well, for one thing, for Stalin's government to admit that it was facing, publicly, to admit that it was facing an enemy with that kind of technological edge to the Red Army, that could conceivably have collapsed their morale. We need to remember that the Red Army, the scale of slaughter being inflicted on it, even when it was winning, was such that they had to have commissars in almost every unit there to enforce the death penalty on deserters. The other thing that we're told about the Eastern Front comes from Colonel Otto Skorzeny, who was part of the German offensive on Moscow in the late autumn and early winter of 1941. Skorzeny noted in his memoirs that the Germans were using what he called liquid air bombs. Okay? So in other words, they were using some sort of primitive equivalent of a fuel air bomb. And if you don't know what a fuel air bomb is, it's a conventional explosive weapon that has the punch of a tactical nuke. In other words, if you see one of these things going off, it would appear to an amateur, to an average person, to be a small nuclear weapon, because you get mushroom cloud and an enormous area of destruction. Well, Skorzeny, in his memoirs, points out that the Germans were using these liquid air bombs in their 11-inch Nebelwerfer, their rocket artillery batteries against the Russians. So in other words, think fuel air bombs and carpet bombing.
Did it pretty much light the air on fire?
Well, a fuel air bomb uses the actual atmospheric oxygen as one of the initiators of the explosion. There are different types of these explosives, but essentially what you do is you set up a molecular chain, and then you detonate it through electrical means. So in other words, you can get an enormous conventional explosion out of these things. So in other words, the Germans are bombarding Russian lines with rocket artillery, and the German 6-barrel rocket launchers. You can just imagine what a battery of those things firing fuel air bombs on the poor Russians would be. Well, it was so bad, in fact, that the Russians, Stalin's government, contacted the Germans via Sweden and said, if you keep this up, we're going to go to poison gas. So in other words, the Russians were saying, let's fight fair here. If you're going to use this stuff on us, then we're going to use our chemical gas on you guys. So there's something. In other words, the bottom line here is that the Germans were willing to use some of their technologies on the supposedly backward and subhuman Slavs that they were fighting in the East, that they would never have considered against the Western Allies until the very, very end of the war, when there are indications that they wanted to use some of these extraordinarily large. I mean, I have a picture. I've seen pictures of these things of extraordinarily large air deliverable fuel air bombs against the Western Allies, and at that point they were desperate and willing to consider anything like that. And what actually prevented them, I forget the guy's name, but there was a Luftwaffe general that in 1945 just absolutely refused to use these things against the Western Allies on moral grounds. The war was lost and there was no point in just creating that kind of carnage. But in other words, the bottom line here is that we're dealing with something extraordinary was going on the Eastern Front. To this day, we don't know exactly what it was. The Russians still aren't talking, perhaps because there are still technological secrets to be gleaned. We simply don't know.
Now, what about rockets that had the capability of striking, let's say, New York City? Was that something that had been developed and talked about, just maybe wasn't implemented?
Yeah. That's another interesting question. There are indicators that the so-called America rocket was at least in, if not close to, testing stage by the end of the war. There are indicators that the Germans may have launched a couple of these very, very large rockets at the Peenemünde facility right toward the end of the war. There is a story that I talk about of Russian ammunition dump in the Ural Mountains that spontaneously blew up. And Soviet propaganda at the time in 1945, in an unusual admission, said, well, this was the work of fascist perfidy. Now, that may mean that, okay, they're blaming their own incompetence on the Nazis again, or they may be telling the truth, that some sort of rocket may have been fired from the center of Europe all the way to the Ural Mountains. We simply don't know.
Now, what about, let's say, Admiral C. Byrd? Does that tie in together with your research in Antarctica?
Admiral C. You mean Admiral Byrd?
Admiral Byrd, yes.
Yeah. I do mention that. There's a lot of people that buy into the mythology of, the Nazis had a secret UFO flying saucer research base in Antarctica. Admiral Byrd went down there with Operation High Jump, an expedition that was outfitted to stay for some 8 months. He went down there, and after basically a couple of weeks, a few weeks, turned tail and ran. On the way back, he lost some seaplanes. He had a full battalion of Marines with him. Why do you need a full battalion of Marines to go to Antarctica?
For a scientific expedition.
For a quote-unquote a scientific expedition, precisely. He turned tail and ran after just a few weeks down there, and on the way back, he had some press from South America, and gave an interview to the El Mercurio of Santiago de Chile. And that's the newspaper. I reproduce it in Reich of the Black Sun, where he supposedly told the reporter that the United States had to prepare itself for enemy fighters that could fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. So everybody in the Nazis had flying saucers camp says that, well, Byrd ran into this secret Nazi UFO flying saucer research factory in Antarctica and was literally chased out of there, and that's why he gave the interview. Well, let's go back to the Bell story here. The Bell story, if you look at it carefully, this is the only device for which, in my opinion, you can make a reasonably plausible case that the Nazis had some sort of incipient field propulsion capability. But the problem with the Bell was that the Germans had to build an entire electrical power plant right there at the facility where the Bell was being tested. Now, what this tells me is that the Bell device had to rely on tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of volts of electric current of direct current nature. All right. In other words, they couldn't simply supply that amount of direct current electricity using batteries and capacitors and so on. Now, what that would mean, therefore, is that if they had a base in Antarctica where they were pursuing this research, they would have had to have built an entire electrical power plant there, all right? Now, obviously, they didn't. And if you've been following the story, this project was continued, at least in some form or fashion, in Argentina, where you would have the infrastructure and capability to do this, but not Antarctica. So what I think really happened during the war with Antarctica is that the Germans probably built some sort of base there, maybe a weather station, maybe some sort of secret U-boat base, and so on and so forth, but certainly not an entire research facility building flying saucers. So what may have happened is they may have had a few sophisticated aircraft based in Patagonia and southern Argentina that may have interdicted Byrd's expedition in Antarctica to keep whatever they did have in Antarctica a secret, but it was not a UFO flying saucer research base or factory or anything like that.
Very interesting. Regardless of that, though, they could have also used some type of geothermal energy, couldn't they have? I've read about Lake Vostok down in Antarctica.
Sure, if they found that, but again, you've got to remember that the German expedition to Antarctica occurred in late 1938, early 1939. So the war begins in just a few months after the return of that expedition from Antarctica. So they would have had to have transported an enormous amount of electrical equipment and then technicians and so on and so forth, and keep it supplied during the war. And this, to me, is simply a logistical impossibility. The German Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was not a large navy at all. The U-boats that they had, most of them at that time when the war breaks out, weren't large enough cargo-carrying U-boats to sustain an operation, much less build something like that. So I find it very, very unlikely even on the geothermal basis.
Now, what about some of the supposed U-boats that, quote-unquote, went missing? Did they go to Argentina?
Oh, boy, that's another story. That's a can of worms, and I don't even really get into that in any of my books in detail. Yes, at the end of the war, there are a number of U-boats that went missing that showed up in Argentina, months after the end of the war in Europe, and they were interred. Argentina, of course, had entered the war very, very late on the side of the Allies. That's another story in and of itself as to why Juan Perón, who was such an ardent pro-Nazi sort of guy, would actually enter the war on the side of the Allies. And briefly, it was to cite his own memoirs here. Juan Perón says something to the effect, and I cite this in the Nazi International, something to the effect that, well, we hadn't lost contact with Germany just because of the declaration of the war, because the declaration actually turned out to be of great service to the Germans, because under international law, it allowed us to go in there with our ships and airplanes and take the Germans out to Argentina. So, in other words, what Perón did was he pulled a fast one on the Allies, because by becoming a co-belligerent with them, he had the right to go into Germany with Argentinian ships and airplanes and fly out a bunch of Nazis and serve them cocktails and peanuts on their way back down to Buenos Aires, where they were going to work on all sorts of cool projects for him, like building triangular jet-powered aircraft and fusion reactors, all the stuff. So, yeah, Argentina is a key player here, but Perón is another wild card in this whole deck. I forget what your original question was.
Oh, at this point, I think I've forgotten what it was. I'm just kind of. It was more about the missing U-boats, but.
Oh yeah, the missing U-boats. Yeah, you've got these U-boats showing up in Argentina. Well, people have to understand something very significant here. That when German production really gets cranking. Pardon me, their war production really gets cranking under Albert Speer circa 1943. They begin, of course, producing U-boats modularly inland and then assembling them on the coast and welding the pieces together. So their production actually begins to go up, even under Allied bombing. And many of these U-boats, the Kriegsmarine did a very, very interesting thing. It would dual number U-boats. So in other words, U-boats that the Allies thought that they had sunk, the Germans would number them with the same number of sunk U-boats. And then the other thing they did was a certain number of U-boats were siphoned off the production line and given directly, and this is so important for people to understand, given directly to Martin Bormann as Nazi Party Reichsleiter. So you actually had a secret U-boat fleet directly under the control of the Nazi Party and directly under the control of Martin Bormann. Now, why is that significant? It's because by early 1943, after the German military disaster at Stalingrad, the upper echelons of the Nazi hierarchy know that the war is lost, and they begin, Bormann in particular, to make long-term strategic plans for the survival of the German economy, for the survival of the German industrial base, and most importantly, for the survival of the Nazi Party as a cohesive entity. So these U-boats were used to transfer out of Europe, usually by way of nationalist Spain, were used to transport enormous amounts of liquid cash, capital, bullion, jewels, and German patents, which began to be, there was this huge operation that Nazi Germany waged in those final years of the war of transferring patent rights to holding companies outside of Germany and then taking the physical documentation and so on and transferring them out of the country altogether. So in other words, the capital flight plan begins circa 1943, and part of that pipeline for all this Nazi loot is quite literally the secret U-boat fleet that Bormann has control of.
That's absolutely fascinating. What about the technology in general, Joseph? Just going back over everything we've talked about today, and where did they get this technology? Did they develop it? Are the Germans just that much more intelligent, or was there so many factors that come into play that it's hard to really detail it?
Well, I don't think the Germans are any more intelligent than the British or the Russians or the Americans or anybody else fighting the war. I think what really you have to account for is that the Germans prior to the war set up within the SS, set up a group, a secret weapons research think tank is the best way to think of it, called the Kammlerstab, and this was based inside the engineering division of the old Škoda armaments works in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. You know, Škoda was to Austria-Hungary in World War I what Krupp is, to the Germans. So, Škoda was a very well-known, is still a very well-known armaments and engineering firm. And the Germans set up this secret research think tank inside the engineering division of the Škoda works in Pilsen. That's about 30 miles due west of Prague. And this think tank was never successfully penetrated by Allied or Soviet intelligence during the war. It had just an extraordinary belt of Gestapo security surrounding it. And incidentally, the man in charge of that security was a fellow by the name of Heinrich Miller, otherwise known as Gestapo Miller, a very close friend and associate of Martin Bormann. Guess who, once again? If you want to think of the Kammlerstab this way, think of it as kind of the Nazi German version of DARPA. Okay, the whole rationale for the existence of this thing was to brainstorm the technology trees of third, fourth, generation weapons. So in other words, they were more or less expected to think outside the box, and I think basically it's the creation of that kind of culture of scientific and technological thinking more than anything else that really gave them the edge to come up with all of these, prototypical modern weapons. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that I think the Kammerstab, in many ways, once General Patton's armies found it when they entered Pilsen, I think this became kind of the model for America's Black Projects world and the establishment of ARPA, later DARPA, under President Eisenhower. So I think the Kammerstab was a direct influence conceptually in that respect. And I think, again, that, I mentioned General Patton in this respect. Patton sitting on top of the command structure of the Third Army would have been privy to all of the field intelligence reports coming in from his units as they enter all of these secret Nazi research facilities. So more than any other American commander, or for that matter, any Allied commander or Russian commander, he had a pretty good, thorough, and probably the most complete picture of the period of anyone in the Allied command structure of just what the Germans were up to, and that may have been a factor in his death.
Now, from all your research, we're coming up on the end of the segment here, Dr. Farrell, but from all your research, we've kind of touched on this a little bit. Where do you stand on the idea of extraterrestrials? Has this just been simply used as a way to deter us from our true history, or is there a little bit of truth to it?
Well, I have never, people accuse me of thinking that, Nazis and black projects explains all UFOs. I've never taken that position. In fact, I've gone out of my way to say over and over again, I'm not philosophically opposed to the idea of extraterrestrials, nor even to the idea that they might be visiting here from other planets or other dimensions or what have you. I'm not opposed to that idea at all. My problem is, as I've said over and over again, if you're of the view that UFOs represent a nuts and bolts technology, and again, I'm not opposed to that idea either, then for me, you have to have a physics signature of a device that would compel you logically to the conclusion that what you're looking at is extraterrestrial. I certainly do not see that in the case of Roswell. I certainly do not see that in the case of Kecksburg and some of these other famous cases. So philosophically, I'm not opposed, but you've got to convince me on a case-to-case basis. Now, I do think, that said, that the extraterrestrial meme has been used as kind of a deflection. And we know this for a fact in the case of the U-2 and the way that the CIA spun the U-2 as UFO sightings. They've admitted to this. People would see the U-2 flying high up in the skies, moving along at a pretty good clip, and, conclude that this had to be a UFO. And the CIA played along with that and stoked the fires. They've admitted this. So we do know that they have used the extraterrestrial meme as a way of cloaking black technologies that may, from time to time, inadvertently be seen.
Well, I'll tell you what, Dr. Farrell, it's all absolutely fascinating. I've researched a lot of this myself. I've read some of your books. I've been studying this for 5 or 6 years now, covering it on the Secret Teachings here and there. To me, it just gives us such a better understanding of our history, and it makes the little holes that seem to appear here and there disappear. It fills all those holes, and it makes things make a lot more sense, at least to me. I want to give you the floor just for a couple of minutes here if you'd like to promote any other work that you might be working on right now, books, whatever it might be. The floor is yours for a couple of minutes.
Well, sure. I wrote, since we're on the subject of extraterrestrials and secret technology, I've written most recently a series of books beginning with Saucers, Swastikas, and Psyops. There's 2 more in that little mini-series. One is called Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. I go into the financing mechanism for all this a great deal in that book. And then another book after that called Covert Wars and the Clash of Civilizations, dealing with the idea that you're dealing with a breakaway civilization, to borrow the insight of Richard Dolan. I do have a website, GizaDeathStar.com. It does have a web store on the website where you can order my books. And I do ask if people are interested in getting my books that they use the web store to order the books from Amazon. I get a little extra in royalties that way. starving author syndrome there at work, folks. But they can order all my books right off my website.
Fantastic. Dr. Joseph Farrell on the program today. This is The Secret Teachings. I am your host, Ryan Gable. His website, GizaDeathStar.com. That's GizaDeathStar.com, where you can find all about him, and you can find all of his information for his books, where you can purchase them. It's also linked up at thesecretteachings.info. That's www.thesecretteachings.info.